Hello class, and welcome to This Week in Health Psychology. This week we will be exploring the psychological factors related to why people do or do not seek medical help. And perhaps even more importantly, what may be helpful psychologically when a person suffers physically. Along these points, I want to share a little story by Mark Williams, author of The Art and Science of Aging Well, as he shows that sometimes when a person is suffering physically, sometimes they need more than just the best medicine that money can buy. Sometimes they need to be heard and loved. So, once upon a time, not that long ago, there was a man who lived an uncomplicated life. One morning he woke and he did not feel well. He could not really describe his malaise, but he definitely was not his usual self. Nothing particularly noteworthy had happened to him except that his dog had died recently of old age. William, an old, scruffy little terrier, was 17 years old. And the man knew for a long time that he was slowly sliding downhill. He was blind and limped, and his death was certainly not a surprise. Anyway, that was weeks ago. The man continued to feel ill, and after a while he decided that he should seek some medical attention. He did not have a primary physician because he had never really been sick. He took no prescription medications, and no particular diseases ran in his family. He did not smoke, and he felt that his lifestyle was basically healthy. Sometimes he would enjoy a beer or two when he watched sports on television. He called a clinic associated with a larger regional medical center, and a pre-recorded voice said that if he was having an emergency, he should hang up and dial 911. He did not think his condition was that urgent, and he waited and was told to listen carefully since the options had changed. He was impressed that people memorized the options and figured out that option 3 was for him, to schedule a new visit. All service representatives were busy helping other customers, and his call was very important to them, so he held until the next available person. For a moment, he almost forgot why he called, and thought he had called his bank or cable company or something like that by mistake. The man was lucky because he happened to have excellent extra insurance, and after answering a number of very personal questions to a complete stranger on the telephone, he had an appointment scheduled. He began to feel a little better because at least he was going to get some help. The day of the appointment arrived none too soon. His malaise was worse, and he looked forward to his visit so that he could feel better and get on with his life. Unfortunately for him, things were about to get much, much more complicated. He arrived at the appointment 30 minutes early with all his photo ID, his extra insurance cards, his health cards, and maybe some credit cards in case he needed to pay for something extra. The check-in was efficient, and he sat down on the waiting room filled with a number of ill-appearing people. Finally, it was his turn. He was weighed and had his vitals recorded, and he was nervous, and his blood pressure was a little elevated according to the attendant. He was ushered into a clean clinic room with a big computer screen commanding up most of the space. The attendant sat with her back to him and asked lots and lots of intimate questions while typing his answers into the computer. Finally, she finished and said the doctor would be with him shortly. The doctor knocked on the door, and before any answer, he barged into the room and sat down at the computer. So I see you're not feeling well, and your blood pressure is 141/82. Have you had headaches, visual changes, chest pain, leg swelling, fever, chills, or night sweats? And many, many more symptoms were listed. No, said the man. I just don't feel well. I see, said the doctor. I will quickly examine you and then order some tests. When was your last colonoscopy? Your last depression rating scale? Your last EKG or blood work? You're the first doctor I've seen since I was a child, said the man. And he remembered the kindly old man who gave him a lollipop after his tetanus shot. Well, you certainly need the complete battery of health maintenance screening and additional lab work then, said the doctor. Have these studies done and I will see you next week. Here's a prescription to treat your hypertension. And the man went home feeling unhealthier, and his arm hurt from all the vaccinations and blood tests. Things went from bad to worse. His blood work was basically normal. But he had pre-diabetes, whatever that was, metabolic syndrome, whatever that was, and now his back hurt, which led to more testing and imaging. His bone density scans showed that he had less bone than he had in his 20s. And he went through much, much more. His coronary arteries had no stentable lesions. His colonoscopy was reassuring. The orthopedic surgeon advised watchful waiting before operating on his hip, his back, and knees. And now regularly took 8 prescription medications, including the opiate for his back pain. At various times of the day, he would have to take his medications and at bedtime. He felt worse than he ever had before, despite having all the quote-unquote best practice testing. He was also beginning to worry about his finances because he wasn't sure he could afford to pay for all of these prescriptions. One evening, he had a remarkable dream. In it, an old man wearing a shimmering light green robe asked him what was the matter. I don't really know, said the man. I just feel unwell and feel like I'm getting worse than I was before I went to the doctor. And he told the man in green his entire story, sparing no detail. The man in green listened thoughtfully. Tomorrow is Saturday, and at 10 o'clock walk down this street until your illness is cured. The man in the green robe said. Cured? How can that be? Asked the man. But the green-robed man disappeared. The next morning, the man felt worse than ever. But he did have a bit of curiosity. At exactly 10, he started walking down the street, as the man in green had directed him to do. It was only a couple of blocks away, and he had to walk anyway, and so why not walk this way? Soon, he saw a boy with a cardboard box. "Hey, mister," called the boy. "Would you like a puppy? I only have one left, and I've named him William." The end of the story. Sometimes what a person needs is to be listened to and loved. Now, deciding when formal medical care is necessary really is a complex problem, and it is so often compounded by personal, social, and economic factors. Now, when we think of seeking medical attention, we can really think of two various forms of behavior: the illness behavior, and that consists of those activities undertaken by people who feel sick and are directed toward determining health status before an official diagnosis. And then there's sick role behavior, and that consists of those activities exhibited by people after they have been diagnosed and are aimed at trying to get well. Now, there are some personal factors that play into this, of course. And personal factors include a person's way of viewing their own body, their stress level, and personality traits as well. Stress affects a person's readiness to seek care. That is, people who experience a great deal of stress are more likely to seek health care than those under less stress, even with equal symptoms. And that's something important to keep in mind. Personality traits also contribute to illness behavior. Participants who score high on neuroticism, that is, those with strong and often negative emotional reactions, generally had high self-reports of illness, whether or not objective evidence confirmed their reports. Gender differences. Gender often plays a role in the decision to seek treatment, with women more likely than men to use health care. Women tend to be more sensitive to their bodies than men, and also report more non-life-threatening symptoms. In addition, women's gender role allows them to seek assistance more readily, whereas the male gender role teaches men to act strong and deny pain and discomfort. Age also plays a factor, and this factor influences a person's willingness to seek medical care, with young adults being more reluctant to see health professionals compared with younger and middle-aged patients. These older people were more likely. And first, they attribute their symptoms to age. Second, they experience more severe and lengthy symptoms. Third, they attribute their symptoms to some other disorder. And fourth, have had previous experience with cardiac problems. There's also socioeconomic, ethnic, and cultural factors related to seeking medical care. People with high socioeconomic levels are less likely than others to have symptoms. But when they do experience pain and discomfort, they are more likely to go to a healthcare professional. A study from the United Kingdom confirmed the notion that culture and ethnic background, not lack of knowledge, are primarily responsible for differences in seeking medical care. Symptom characteristics often influence when and how people respond to illness. People are most likely to seek medical care when their symptoms are quite visible to themselves and to others. and they view the symptoms as severe. Third, their symptoms interfere with their lifestyle. And fourth, that their symptoms recur or are persistent. And people who seek or not seek medical care based on their incomplete and sometimes inaccurate beliefs about health and illness. Howard Leventhal and his colleagues identified 5 components in the conceptualization of illness. First, people need to label, that is, identify the disease, their symptoms, and a non-threatening label seems to alleviate symptom anxiety. Second, when people receive a diagnosis, they think about the timeline of both the disease and the treatment. Third, most people feel less anxious when they can attribute some cause to their symptoms. Fourth, people think of the consequences of the disease. And some people overestimate or underestimate the mortality rates of certain diseases. And fifth, people who believe that they can control their disease process are less likely than others to seek health care. And finally, the sick role. After people become convinced that they are ill, they adopt the sick role, which allows them both privileges and responsibilities. The privileges include the right to make decisions concerning health-related issues. Second, the right to be exempt from normal responsibilities and duties. Third, the right to become dependent on others for assistance. Their 3 responsibilities are: first, the duty to maintain health as well as get well. Second, the duty to perform routine health care management. And third, the duty to use a range of health care resources. Now, how do people seek medical information from non-medical sources? Well, once an individual notes symptoms, that person must decide if he or she is going to seek help. Individuals often turn to family or friends, also known as the lay referral network, and the internet before they seek health information from a doctor. So when we think of the lay referral network, that is really a network of friends and family who offer information and advice before any official medical treatment is sought. Thus, people's social networks are often a first source of information and advice on health matters, but may not always encourage people to seek traditional medical care. And then, of course, there's the internet. And the internet has become an additional source of health information. The majority of internet users in the United States and Canada have used the internet to seek health information. Women and those with higher education are more likely to seek health information on the internet. However, like the lay referral network, the internet can be a source of health misinformation. Now, what does it mean to be healthy? Well, for the majority of people living in the Western world, being healthy is the norm. Most people are healthy for most of the time. Therefore, beliefs about being ill exist in the context of beliefs about being healthy. So, for example, illness means not being healthy. Illness means feeling different to usual. Now, the World Health Organization defined good health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And this definition presents a broad, multidimensional view of health that departs from the traditional medical emphasis on physical health only. Over recent years, this multidimensional model has emerged throughout the results of several qualitative studies that have asked laypeople the question, what does it mean to be healthy? So, for example, from a social anthropological perspective, Hellman, back in 1978, explored the extent to which beliefs inherited from the 18th century's humoral theory have survived along with those of conventional medicine. In particular, he focused on the saying, feed a cold and starve a flu, and argued that lay constructs of health could be conceptualized according to the dimensions hot and cold and wet and dry. For example, problems with the chest are considered either hot and wet, that is a fever and productive cough, or cold and wet, cold and non-productive cough. Likewise, problems could be considered hot and dry, for example, fever, dry skin, flushed face, dry throat, non-productive cough, or cold and dry, something like a cold, shivering, rigor, malaise, vague muscle aches. In a similar vein, medical sociologists have also explored lay concepts of health. For example, also in the 1970s, researchers interviewed 80 French subjects and categorized their models of health into 3 dimensions. Health in a vacuum, implying the absence of illness. The reserve of health, relating to physical strength and resistance to illness. And equilibrium, indicating a full realization of a person's reserve of health. Likewise, Baxter in the 1990s asked 9,000 individuals to describe someone who they thought was healthy and to consider what makes you call them healthy and what is it like when you are healthy. A qualitative analysis was then carried out on a subsample of these individuals. For some, health simply meant not feeling ill. However, for many, health was seen in terms of a reserve, a healthy life filled with health behaviors, physical fitness, having energy and vitality, social relationships with others, being able to function effectively, and an expression of psychosocial wellness. Now, Baxter also examined how a concept of health varied over the course of life and investigated any sex differences. And other researchers have explored the health beliefs of women in England and argued that their models of health could be conceptualized in 2 sets of definitions. Positive definitions, including feelings like being energetic, having plenty of exercise, feeling fit, eating the right things, being the correct weight, having a positive outlook, and having a good life and good relationships. And negative definitions, including not getting colds and coughs, not being stuck in bed, rarely going to the doctor, and not needing checkups. So, nothing wrong. So the issue of what is healthy has also been explored from a psychological perspective with a particular focus on health and illness cognitions. For example, Lau in 1995 found that when young healthy adults were asked to describe in their own words what being healthy means to you, their beliefs about health could be understood within the following dimensions. So, the physiological, the physical, for example, I feel good, I'm in good condition, and I have lots of energy. The psychological perspective, for example, I feel healthy, I'm energetic, and I feel good psychologically, I'm not depressed. Behaviorally, for example, I eat well, I sleep well. Future consequences, for example, I plan to live a long time. And the absence of illness, for example, I'm not sick, I have no diseases, I have no symptoms. And Lau argued that most people show a positive definition of health, not just the absence of illness, which also includes more than just physical and psychological factors. He suggested that healthiness in most people's normal state represents a backdrop to their beliefs about being ill. And psychological studies of beliefs of the elderly in the 1980s and 1990s showed that those suffering from a chronic illness, and as well as those that are children, have reported that these individuals conceptualize health as being multidimensional. And this includes some overlap between professional, that is WHO, and lay views of health. So what does it mean to be ill? In his study about the beliefs of young, healthy adults, Lau asked participants, what does it mean to be sick? And their answers indicated the dimensions they use to conceptualize illness. Not feeling normal, for example, I don't feel right. Specific symptoms, for example, physiological or psychological symptoms. Specific illness, for example, things like cancer or cold or depression. Consequences of the illness, for example, I can't do what I usually do. There's normally a timeline involved. So, for example, how long are these symptoms going to last? And then finally, the absence of health, for example, just simply not being healthy. And these dimensions of what it means to be ill have been described within the context of illness cognitions, also called illness beliefs or illness representations. So what are illness cognitions? Well, Leventhal and his colleagues define illness cognitions as a patient's own implicit common sense beliefs about their illnesses. And they propose that these cognitions provide patients with a framework or schema for coping with and understanding their illness, and telling them what to look out for if they are becoming ill. And using interviews with patients suffering from a variety of different illnesses, Leventhal and his colleagues defined and identified 5 cognitive dimensions of these beliefs. First, identity. And this refers to the label given to the illness, and as well as the symptoms. So, for example, I have a cold, the diagnosis, with a runny nose, the symptoms. The second, the perceived cause of the illness. And these causes may be biological, such as viral, or a lesion, or psychosocial, such as stress, or health-related behavior. In addition, patients may hold representations of illness that reflect a variety of different causal models. For example, my cold was caused by a virus, or my cold was caused by being run down and being tired and overworked. And then there's the timeline, the third definition or dimension. And this refers to the patient's beliefs about how long the illness will last, whether or not that's accurate. But it's normally defined as either acute, so short term, or chronic, that is long term. So my cold will be over in a few days, would be an example of an illness cognition for the timeline. Then there are the consequences, and this refers to the patient's perceptions of the possible effects of the illness on their life. Such consequences may be physical, so pain, lack of mobility, or emotional, loss of social contact or loneliness, or a combination of factors. So, for example, my cold will prevent me from playing football, which will prevent me from seeing my friends. And then fifth, the curability and controllability of the disorder. Patients also represent illness in terms of whether they believe that the illness is going to be treated and can be treated and cured, and the extent to which the outcome of their illness is controllable either by themselves or by a powerful other. If I rest, for example, my cold will go away. Or if I get medication from my doctor, my illness will go away. Now, there's some support for illness cognitions that come from two different types of research, both qualitative and quantitative. And Leventhal and his colleagues carried out interviews with individuals who were chronically ill and had been recently diagnosed as having cancer, and with healthy adults. And the resulting descriptions of illness suggest underlying beliefs that are made up of the aforementioned dimensions. And Leventhal and his colleagues argued that interviews are the best way to access illness cognitions. And so qualitative research certainly is a useful way of exploring. However, according to Leventhal, interviews encourage subjects to express their own beliefs, not those expected by the interviewer. And that can be a positive. The thing is that sometimes it doesn't allow you to be as precise as you want to be, and so sometimes it's valuable to have quantitative research. And other studies have been used more artificial and controlled methodologies. And these too have provided support for the dimensions of illness cognitions. Lau used quantitative research in using a card sorting technique to evaluate how subjects conceptualize illness. They asked 20 subjects to sort 65 statements into piles that make sense to them. And these statements had been made previously in response to descriptions of your most recent illness. And they reported that the subjects' piles of categories reflected the dimensions of identity, so that is diagnosis and symptoms, consequences, the possible effects, timeline, how long it will last, the cause, what caused the illness, cure and control, how and whether it can be treated. And so there are lots of different examples of ways of doing both qualitative and quantitative research in order to get at understanding how people organize their thoughts. And in understanding how people organize their thoughts, we can come up with ways of understanding how people make their decisions relating to their health. And one of those models is known as the self-regulation model. And Leventhal incorporates his description of illness cognitions into his self-regulatory model of illness behavior. And this model is based on approaches to problem solving and suggests that illness and symptoms are dealt with by individuals in the same way as other problems. And it is assumed that, given a problem or a change to the status quo, the individual will be motivated to solve the problem and reestablish their state of normality. Now, traditional models describe problem solving in three stages. First off, the interpretation, that is making sense of the problem, coping, that is dealing with the problem in order to regain a state of equilibrium, and third, appraisal, assessing how successful the coping stage has been. And according to the models of problem solving, these three stages will continue until the coping strategies are deemed to be successful and a state of equilibrium has been attained. In terms of health and illness, if healthiness is an individual's normal state, then any onset of illness will be cause for using this model. So the first stage, interpretation. An individual may be confronted with the problem of a potential illness through two various channels. First off, symptom perception. So for example, I have a pain in my chest, or social messages. The doctor has diagnosed this pain as angina. And once the individual has received information about the possibility of illness through these channels, according to theories of problem solving, the individual is then motivated to return to a state of problem-free normality. And this involves assigning meaning to the problem. According to Leventhal, the problem can be given meaning by accessing the individual's illness cognitions. Therefore, the symptoms and social messages will contribute towards the development of illness cognitions, which will be constructed according to the following dimensions: identity, cause, consequences, timeline, and cure and control, just like we've already mentioned. And these cognitive representations of the problem will give the problem meaning and will enable the individual to develop and consider suitable coping strategies. However, a cognitive representation is not the only consequence of symptom perception and social messages. The identification of the problem of illness will also result in changes in the person's emotional state. For example, perceiving the symptom of pain and receiving the social message that this pain may be related to coronary heart disease may result in anxiety. And therefore, any coping strategies have to relate to both the illness cognitions and the emotional state of the individual. And then stage 2, the coping. And the next stage in this self-regulatory model is the development and identification of suitable coping strategies. And two broad categories of coping have been defined that incorporate the multitude of other coping strategies. So, approach coping. Things like taking pills, going to the doctor, resting, talking to friends about emotions, and avoidance coping, denial, and wishful thinking. And when faced with the problem of illness, the individual will therefore develop coping strategies in an attempt to return to a state of health, normality. And then stage 3, appraisal. And the third stage of the self-regulatory model is appraisal. And this involves individuals evaluating the effectiveness of the coping strategy and determining whether to continue with this strategy or whether to opt for an alternative one. And this self-regulatory model then ties in with the whole idea of self-regulation and seeking healthcare. So this process is regarded as self-regulatory because the three components of the model, the interpretation, the coping, the appraisal, interrelate in order to maintain the status quo. That is, they regulate the self. Therefore, if the individual's normal state is health, and it's disrupted by illness, the model proposes that the individual is motivated to return to the balance between back to normality. And this self-regulation involves the three processes interrelating in an ongoing and dynamic fashion. Therefore, an interaction occurs between the different stages. So, for example, symptom perception may result in an emotional shift, which may exacerbate the perception of symptoms. So, for example, I can feel a pain in my chest. Now I feel anxious. Now I can feel more pain as all my attention is focused on it. Now, if the individual opts to use denial as a coping strategy, this may result in the reduction of symptom perception, a decrease in any negative emotions, and a shift in their illness cognitions. And this, they might say to themselves, this pain is not very bad, so denial. But now I feel less anxious, the emotions, and this pain will not last that long, the timeline. And this illness will not have any serious consequences to my lifestyle, the consequences. Or there might be positive appraisal of the effectiveness of the coping strategy, and that may itself be a coping strategy. So my symptoms appear to have been reduced by doing relaxation exercises. And in all honesty, this may be a form of denial. So you can see that there are a lot of coping strategies that go into an individual evaluating their symptoms as well as helping them to seek medical attention. But overall, according to Leventhal, there are two main ways that research suggests that people will seek healthcare. So to put it as simply as I can, to conclude this lecture, subjects were less likely to tolerate the combined distress of an ambiguous symptom and a concurrent life stressor if the stressor onset was not recent. And under such conditions, subjects were more likely to seek healthcare. Current life stressors did not affect care seeking for symptoms that were clear signs of disease, and these symptoms were readily identified as health threats in need of medical attention. And so these findings contribute to a better theoretical understanding of how people perceive their physical states and how they cope with stress. So, all that to say this. So simply put, if things are not clear, a person will typically only seek help if there is an additional current life stressor. Basically, the person seeks help to manage the stress, not the illness, unless the symptom is clear and is clearly associated with a disease. So that's it for this week. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.